Thank you very much for inviting me, Katharina, and for this introduction. And I'll jump straight into the slide presentation. Let me just find the slides. Here we are. Share. Okay. Am I now? Hold on. Now I'm in presentation mode, and now it's working. Great. So yeah, as you already said, one of the four main themes for Euroskills 2023 is going to be regenerative economy. And I, from my personal perspective, after spending 20 years of looking at how change happens in ecosystems and eco-social systems, and how health and resilience is structured in all biological processes, particularly when we zoom out from looking at just species and individuals to looking at life as a planetary process. In doing that research, I've come to the conclusion that we need to speak in plural when we speak about regenerative economy. We need to talk about regenerative economies. Of course, there will be always a global economy and global exchange, but we've spent too long focused on globalization as the one driver and have not paid enough attention to how regional populations are actually fitted in and fitting into the biophysical conditions of place. That's why this beginning map is a map of the world's river systems. This is a biophysical map. The map that we're used to with the national boundaries is a socio-political map. And what we need to do in terms of becoming a regenerative presence on Earth again as the human species is to fit our patterns of inhabitation back into these biophysical boundaries. And this conversation has been going on for a long time. On the left, you can see the report that the New Economics Foundation in London produced in 2002, which was called Plugging the Leaks, where they were highlighting all the negative side effects of the globalizing economy. And on the right is just one of those examples of how extreme we've now taken globalization, that you can get people moving pairs around the globe just to get them packaged, and then to sell them, like basically from New Zealand, you move pairs to Asia to get them packaged, and then you send them to the east of the United States, which is one of the large pear producers in the American continent. And those kind of excesses of globalization don't really make sense, and they also don't make any sense on a planet where we are increasingly waking up to the fact that we are facing a climate and an extinction emergency. And a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic started, the world's youth went to the streets with Extinction Rebellion and with Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Future to call for a right for a livable future. And I was very happy to see when Extinction Rebellion produced the 10 principles, and one of them was we need a regenerative culture, creating a culture which is healthy, resilient, and adaptable. That's a direct quote from my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures. But they did drop the S, they did drop the plural. And I just want to reiterate, as we talk about regenerative economy, we need to say, how would a regenerative economy at the global scale be structured that it would have healthy local and regional economies? And how do we skill up people now for the kind of global local, living very locally attuned, but in global exchange and collaboration? And I think that's a very relevant question for Euroskills 2023. And I also want to go back to a report that WorldScales Russia and Global Education Futures did a couple of years ago, where they looked at the key skills for the 2020s. And the green line, the regenerative horizon, is the line that we're talking about in terms of how do we skill people up for that kind of transition that is mapped out here. And before I go into more detail on that, let me just give you the overall, because we talk a lot about regenerative, and it helps to give you a little bit of a context that all importantly doesn't sell regenerative as the new thing that you now have to brand everything with and then dismiss everything that came before, nor does it say that regenerative is just a new word that we can just slap on things. But it's important lately, as many consultants are shifting towards teaching people of how to create regenerative business and how to create regenerative fashion and regenerative tourism. Let's not dismiss the hard work that people have done for decades on sustainability. Sustainability is still a bridge that we haven't crossed yet. Let's understand that the SDGs can help us as a platform of conversation around how would we implement the SDGs in a more regenerative, forward-thinking, dynamic, capacity-building way. But of course, since we're talking about the topic of regenerative economies, you might notice that I put a spanner into the works of SDG number 8, because we also, as we're talking about the SDGs, need to talk about how do we define success in an economy, and to what extent gross national product is not an adequate measure of success, and actually goes up when certain things happen in society that are actually detrimental to ecosystem and human population health. So we need to redefine growth. We need to shift from quantitative growth to qualitative growth in order to be able to implement the SDGs, but we shouldn't dismiss the SDGs altogether as we're now moving towards what would regeneration really mean. Because I think the bottom line of this graph is particularly instructive. This comes from Carol Sanford. She speaks about that there are 4 paradigms operative at one and the same time at the moment in postmodernity. One of them is the classical neoliberal economics paradigm of extract value. The next one is more of a shareholder capitalism that says, let's see to all the negative side effects of this extract value capitalism and arrest the disorder it causes. Let's do a little bit better. Then the next paradigm is say, no, we've done so much damage for so long, we need to restore, we need to heal, we need to do good. We need to be net positive, business likes to use these days. But when we're talking about regeneration, we're talking about something else. All of that transition is important. And of course, we want to restore and regenerate and do good. But it's not about the final projects that are implemented. It's always about building the capacity to evolve for people in place to manifest their unique potential. And that brings us back to why regenerative economies, or why plural regenerative cultures, because this has to be work that comes out of the uniqueness of place and out of the uniqueness of local culture. And only if we do that do we actually work truly regeneratively from potential rather than from solving problems. And the deliverable is not some kind of final project or product, but the deliverable is the capacity of people in place to keep evolving. So it is all about rethinking education. It's all about reskilling. It's all about reconsidering the relationship between cities and their hinterland, their bioregion. So in many ways, it addresses all the things that Euroskills 2023 will address, but it does so in a dynamic way of building the capacity to learn. And so just one key concept in this way of thinking regeneratively is that we far too long have spent the time in arguments between some form of activating force and some form of restraining force. The drive of globalization and the limits of the planet, for example. And then we try to compromise. And compromise is always bringing the potential and the energy down. It's always either side not quite getting what they see as the maximum potential. So what would be a path towards really harmonizing this polarity and trying to take the next step up to really serve evolution in this dynamic between activating and restraining force? And the way we can make this happen is by focusing on place. If we keep focusing on planetary problems and abstract problem solving rather than manifesting local potential and working with place, we're not making that key shift towards really working with the uniqueness that all the people in that place, that the history of that place, that the ecosystem, that the climate, that all the conditions in a particular region have. And another way of putting this in, because these days a lot of people talk about theory U and Otto Schama, and in that context, there's a lot of talk about the shift from ego to eco. But that's just another pendulum swing that has the danger of not finding a healthy relationship with self and with individualism. But if we put ego and eco into service of life, and we understand that the best way for an individual to manifest their uniqueness is actually in service to the larger whole that they're embedded in, and that's society and the local ecosystem. And with that, of course, also the planet. And this is a very ancient term, because Seva, the Vedanta in India, has built an entire life philosophy around being in service to life. And it's the kind of life philosophy that all indigenous cultures have had. So importantly, what I want to point out as people are beginning to talk about regenerative cultures is that they're not anything new. They're actually, the large journey of humanity has been regenerative cultures, bioregionally focused, being custodians of the places they inhabited, and nurturing the ecosystems to full productivity and continued abundance over time. Some people, some indigenous people have lived in place for 10,000, or even in Australia, between 40 and 100,000 years, as a continuous tradition in relationship with place. And we still have something to learn from that as we move forward and look at how do we heal the planet again. This is a picture of me in 2006 when I did my PhD on design for human and planetary health. And in those days, nobody really understood what I tried to talk about when I spoke about planetary health. And what's wonderful for me personally is to see that it only took 10 years for the Lancet, one of the main medical journals, and the Rockefeller Foundation to start a planetary health program and then launch the Planetary Health Alliance. And now there's 270 universities around the world that are researching into planetary health much more from a policy perspective. But their key point is, which is what I was trying to do with my PhD work, is to highlight that personal health, family health, community health, population health, ecosystems health, and planetary health are all interlinked. Health is an emergent property of a complex dynamic system at different scales. And we need to pay attention to planetary health if we want to create a healthy economy. There will not be a regenerative economy if we don't have healthy ecosystems and a healthy planet. And so this professor for planetary health, Tony Capon, created this schemata that I think, as we're working around skills, it would serve us to look at how do we feed ourselves, how do we move the world, how do we house the world, how do we power the world, but to do so always in the context of how do we manage ourselves to leave no one behind in terms of values, education, regulation, and the economic system. So ultimately driving a process of healing places, of healing local ecosystems as a way of meeting both human needs and creating planetary health. Again, just to highlight, I've kind of said it already, I had once a conversation with Bill Reed from Regenesis Group, who are one of the deep practitioners in regenerative development. And he said to me, Danny, you can't save or heal the planet. You can only save or heal places. And this is an example, like the planet floating in space becomes such an abstraction, and we can spend ages, like we do at COP26, have arguments of how to finally come together to solve the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis. But if we focus on one place and we just get to work, like the Chinese did at the Loess Plateau, we can work miracles. And in the process, we can sequester carbon and begin to address these global problems. But the global problems are not addressed by abstracting into ever more abstract solutions or problem definitions, and then finding solutions that have to be implemented in every place, scaled up, as so often is talked about. We don't need to scale up. We need to scale out, very sensitive to the uniqueness of place. So I'm suggesting, and the rest of this talk is going to introduce this concept of working on bioregional economies, because localizing economies to just a few small community doesn't give you the dynamics that a certain economics of scale and a certain fitting to local ecosystems has. But the bioregional scale is where we could potentially provide 60 to 80% of the core needs of a regional population within a dynamic, vital economy in that region. And that will offer opportunities for innovation, for education, for diverse skilled labor force, for resilient labor markets because of that diversity. It wouldn't be so dependent on global fluctuations and global supply lines. But it would still, of course, be in intimate relationship with places across the planet around innovation, knowledge transfer, and technology transfer. But it is at that regional scale where we can heal the activating of the international world and the restraining of the local and begin to create the maximum potential for a place. The bioregion sits nicely in that structured hierarchy of a healthy individual and a healthy planet. It allows us to capture the complexity, but it's specific enough that we can manage the complexity. If we try to solve problems at global levels, the complexity just goes out of hand. So the way to heal the planet is to heal it bioregion by bioregion, ecosystems by ecosystem. And we can do so by creating healthy economies, reinventing education, giving people a sense of place again and a connection to place, creating increased civic participation. It's a win-win-win-win-win. It addresses so many issues that we're currently struggling with. From a design perspective, the bioregion also integrates all the issues of green chemistry, product design, architecture, community design, industrial ecology, a circular economy, and urban planning into one cohesive but ecosystems sourced way of thinking. So the way to make the circular economy happen is by understanding that it becomes most effective when the loops are short, meaning in short distances, local and regional loops, rather than wide continental loops of recycling material. This is just another way of demonstrating that I'm working with ETH Zurich on a master's in designing regenerative and resilient systems. And one of the PhD students there has turned the previous graphic into this graphic of finding a more dynamic way of saying, how do we integrate the different scales of design at the bioregional scale and make that design unique to the biomaterial resources and also the renewable energy resources of that region. Talking about regenerative economies, we should definitely also highlight that there's a lot of work been done by the Capital Institute in New York. And these different principles of a regenerative economy that John Fullerton has proposed are very useful as we work on bioregional economies. And interestingly, John Fullerton and I also came to the same conclusion that the scale of activity around which we can create regenerative economies is at the bioregional scale. And if you look at, there's a website that is linked to the Capital Institute in New York called the Regenerative Communities Network. And it brings together initiatives that are really bioregional economic regenerative change networks. They're networks in the US and Costa Rica and a number of places around the world where people have started to coalesce around how do we activate our regional economy, and through that address lots of social, economic, and environmental issues. And in my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, I spend a lot of time putting the questions in the foreground rather than some sort of principle or answer or guidelines like we tend to do. And I do that very much on purpose, because when you, as educators, some of you are educators, when you ask a question, you're asking people to engage. You're asking people about their opinion. You're creating participation. If you give a set of principles, you're asking people to join the bandwagon and follow a set of new rules. And it's always much more engaging, and you get more of the uniqueness of each person's possible contribution if you start with questions. So I've turned John Fullerton's 8 principles for regenerative economics into a set of 8 questions. And I won't go into them in detail, but as you're working in your different contexts around creating regenerative economy, ask yourself those questions, but with a specific focus on your bioregion and your place. So I'm not talking about this just theoretically. I live on the island of Mallorca. I moved here because islands are very useful case studies for bioregional change. And I've been trying to work on both Mallorca and the Balearics as a conceptual container for how would we drive bioregional change. And it's a very subtle, it's not a roadmap, blueprint, key performance indicator type project. You have to bring such complexity together that it's much more about creating a platform for conversation and seeding the right information and the right connection in the system so new regenerative patterns emerge. And it also is about highlighting that in each place there are many organizations that are contributors to a regenerative cultural context, but they don't necessarily see themselves that way. Some of them help single moms, some of them help people who are starving, others help recycling, the next one help building the circular economy. But if we begin to focus on a region and we begin to tell all these different aspects within the same narrative of we are in this place and we're doing something, we're serving people and place through our different activities, then we can create that participation and civic engagement that is so vital in a world where we will have a lot of dynamic change in the next century. So there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. Wendell Berry. I love this quote. It's like, how do we come back to seeing place as sacred again and seeing ourselves as expressions of place, celebrating the uniqueness of its culture and its ecosystem? And there are always people in each place that will resonate and their hearts will jump with joy when you invite that conversation. Again, I won't go into much detail on this, but it's a extremely useful way of thinking about the dynamics of change in socio-ecological systems. And it's understanding that when there are breakdowns, this breakdown is actually the prelude to breakthroughs and reorganization. And I think right now we're living through the breakdowns of many systems in the world that are no longer fit for purpose. And it's very useful to give people who are beginning to be afraid of these collapses an understanding that we can work with these collapses creatively and make them the seeding of these diverse regenerative economies of the future, that make them the beginning of the healing of humanity's relationship with the planet and with place. And so I've talked a lot about bioregions. Let me just give a little bit of time to what is a bioregion, a natural region where people can functionally integrate into the biophysical reality of place and planet. And there's an organization in the UK called the Bioregional Development Group that have created these 10 principles for one planet living around bioregional living. And again, another resource that I encourage you to follow up on. And another way of defining a bioregion is to say that in acknowledging humans as part of a landscape scale ecosystems, we can provide a holistic management context that allows us to really bring together cultural, environmental, and economic attributes of that place. That's the social, ecological, economic, and political, cultural aspects really come together when you start a conversation about what would it mean for the people in this place to live regeneratively in this place, to heal the local ecosystem, to create more social cohesion, to create more collaboration, to create an education where universities become bioregional learning centers and schools make people fall in love with their place again because they teach all the sciences and all the other disciplines, in part through the place again, through making people connect to place. And it will be different in every place around the world. And that's why the path towards a regenerative future is through diverse regenerative cultures and diverse regenerative economies. And give you some examples of this already happening. With regard to ecology, the Common Land Foundation and the Ecosystems Restoration Camp have developed this 4 return strategy of how do we bring back a healthy, vibrant local economy through the process of healing and restoring local ecosystems. In the context of the UN decade that we just started of ecosystems restoration, this is a practical methodology of how to implement it. And importantly, if we're talking about ecosystems and regeneration, we need to give ourselves a 20-25-year timescale, because ecosystems don't grow at the rhythm of 4-year economic plans. They grow at the rhythm of ecosystems. And that means that we need 20 years to fully regenerate the region. But this notion of the 4 returns, the return of inspiration is that telling a story powerful enough that people find meaning by reconnecting to place and by healing their place and by doing their bit to heal their place in the context of climate change and extinction emergency and all the global problems we have. And by finding that shared vision, the social capital returns. And by working together to heal ecosystems and build the collaboration socially to do that in a way that also creates new enterprises, we're basically healing, bringing back the natural capital, which ultimately then actually becomes a very powerful driver of bringing back financial capital. So there is an economic return in this, but it takes a little longer and it takes a little patient capital. And there's a wonderful report on the Common Land Foundation website of how to apply this methodology. Another highlight that I find is beginning to travel around the world is Kate Raworth's work around the donut economics model that acknowledges that in order to create a regenerative human future where we live within the planetary boundaries and we don't degrade the planet any further, we need to have the socio-ecological foundations. And that's basically what the donut is, the socio-ecological foundations and the planetary boundaries. And of course, we're already transgressing them or we're not reaching them in different countries. And it's a very useful, much more qualitative fingerprint type assessment of a bioregion to say, what's the donut look like for us? Where are we strong in our socioeconomic basis and where are we not? And how do we contribute to transgressing planetary boundaries with our behaviors? And how would we do that differently? And in many ways, that's what the methodology that the Donut Economics Action Lab has developed through working with cities is a methodology of creating a localized or regionalized donut, which you can apply to a city or you can apply to a bioregion. And another example of showing this is already happening is a wonderful project in England, near Totnes, where the first transition town was started, which is called the Bioregional Learning Center, started by a woman called Isabella Carlisle. And again, I highly recommend looking at that website because it gives an example of somebody doing what I'm talking about here. Somebody bringing local actors, very diverse local actors, together around meeting around the potential of their place and working through the issues and the problems of their place, but in a way that starts with the uniqueness of that place. And it's really inspiring work. And then we were talking within Euroskills 2023, one of them is the rethinking of cities. And that means finally getting to the point of not seeing the city in a vacuum in a global economy, but to remember that if we talk about cities, we have to talk about them within the context of their ecosystem, their bioregion. And the founder of town planning, which happened to be a biologist called Sir Patrick Geddes in Scotland over 100 years ago, he almost by accident, by working in a participatory way in the old town of Edinburgh, doing urban renewal work with the lowlives of the city and inventing in the process the first student union, he understood that in order to heal a city, you need to reconnect a city to its bioregion. And there's a book that came out in 2014, I believe, from a friend of mine, Herbert Girardig, who's one of the council members of the World Future Council, wrote a book on creating regenerative cities. And a shorter version of that book was published by the World Future Council. So if you want to learn more about how to make that shift from the highly fossil fuel and petrol dependent petropolis that is globalized to an ecopolis that still has all the global connections of knowledge exchange and a global economy, but is actually much more rooted and becomes the driver of economic diversification and ecosystems regeneration in its local region. So we really need to rethink cities in the region. And so just to finish up, you can see that in my mind, the four key themes of Euroskills 2023, rethinking education, reskilling cities, resilience of labor markets, regenerative economy, are actually all coming into action if we think them through in that global local way of saying, how would this look like in our place and in our bioregion? And let's strengthen local food, water, energy sovereignty. Let's strengthen the capacity of people in place to keep evolving into an uncertain future. Let's not just create projects that look good, but make every project part of education. Anything that gets implemented in such a way that it creates civic participation and actually creates capacity in everybody who's involved in the project. And if you want to see more about regenerative projects around the world, and more about the history, Buckminster Fuller Institute is a great place to go. Bucky Fuller, over 50 years ago, already understood that life is inherently regenerative, and our job as human beings is to fit back into that regenerative process. And regen.earth would bring up a Google map with lots of different initiatives around the world that are already working in a very grassroots way on implementing this vision. I also love this term that is by now also over 40 years old, by the poet Gary Snyder, who was one of the influences of the first bioregional movement in the United States, which happened in the 1960s and 1970s. And in his, I can't read this quote without, because I need to briefly move the, hold on a sec. How do I get these windows away? I'm almost done. We'll just cut this slide out and I just continue with the next slide. Yeah, is that okay? Okay.
Absolutely.
So before finishing, I would feel amiss by not highlighting some of the deeper work that lies behind regenerative development thinking that has particularly been developed by Kara Sanford and people in the Regenesis group. And to highlight that when we're talking about regeneration, we're really talking about moving back into the evolutionary process that is behind life itself. And one way of doing that is through these 7 foundational principles of the regenerative approach that Kara Sanford proposes, of looking at wholes, potential, essence, development, nestedness, nodal interventions, and creating a field of collaboration. All those ideas would take far too long to unpack, but if you want to go deep into this, look at the work of Kara Sanford. And another way of making it more palpable is that really the 4 core aspects of working regeneratively is working with whole systems as conscious participants, not as manipulators and predictors and controllers from the outside. It's working not on problems, but on manifesting inherent potential in people and in place. and it's developing capacity rather than just working on projects, while building overall a field of collaboration that actually evolves people's capacity to keep being regenerative into the future. And this is a set of tools. I didn't know this was going to be a building slide. I'm apologizing for that. That friends of mine from the h3uni.org, the University of the Third Horizon, have developed a set of very useful methodologies that can help you facilitate these local conversations about what would it look like to create a regenerative economy in this place. And if you go to this website, they're all free of charge, very useful methodologies of working with transformative change. And finally, last slide, second to last slide, a book came out just a couple of months ago, which brings together 24 essays of people who are working on this around the planet. And it's called Thrive: Fundamentals for a New Economy. Highly recommended, very different perspectives, and you will get introduced to the ecosystems of people that already work in this. For example, Christian Felber's Economy of the Common Good, or Charles Eisenstein's Economy of the Sacred, or the work of R3.0, who are also full of useful resources for people in policy and education developing this. Right, thank you very much. That's me with the presentation.